I now welcome the first witnesses from Meta Australia. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Thank you, Chair. My name's Mia Garlick and I'm a Regional Director of Policy for Meta across Asia and including in Australia.
And Chair, my name's Josh Machin. I'm Meta's Head of Public Policy in Australia. Thanks for the chance to appear.
Thank you, and I welcome my committee colleagues, the Deputy Chair Senator Walsh and fellow committee member Senator Chandler, and I believe there'll be other Senate colleagues joining us throughout the day to ask questions. I now invite Meta to make an opening statement and then we will ask questions. Could you please keep the statement to 3 minutes or less, given that we've got a number of topics to canvass?
Certainly, Chair, and thank you to you and the committee for giving us the opportunity to join you this morning. And I wanted to first start by recognising the traditional owners of the land that I'm dialing in from today. It's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. We certainly here at Meta welcome the opportunity to engage with Australian policymakers around the issues relevant to this inquiry, such as combating foreign interference and the spread of misinformation on social media and technology platforms. And we recognise that there is a renewed interest in these issues in the lead up to the Voice referendum, but we have been engaged constructively with both versions of this committee over the last 3 years in response to similar important civic moments, making 3 submissions and appearing before the committee in 2021 as well. As you know, on this committee, foreign interference can take many forms, including cyber espionage, deceptive influence operations, and financially motivated inauthentic behaviour. And these threats can amplify distrust in the integrity of elections, governance, and civic discourse, and undermine community confidence in democracy. At Meta, we're committed to combating foreign interference on our services and do this by 3 main strategies. So firstly, we build automated defences that leverage machine learning to detect and block bad actors. So, for example, our systems find and block millions of fake accounts every day, most within minutes of creation. Secondly, while automated systems are an important part of our security strategy, we know that sophisticated actors can still get past them, and that's why we have a team of threat intelligence analysts who can hunt for and disrupt what we call coordinated inauthentic behaviour, which includes foreign interference and influence operations. And finally, we also share information with our counterparts in industry, with government, civil society and the media. We also work closely with Australian government agencies. So ahead of last year's federal election, we worked closely with the Australian Electoral Commission and the government's Election Integrity Assurance Task Force, and with a range of government and law enforcement agencies. This past week, we've announced a suite of measures we're taking to promote safety and integrity across our platforms ahead of the Voice referendum, and we've developed a comprehensive strategy in consultation with First Nations communities to combat misinformation and voter interference, as well as other forms of abuse that could occur on our platform in the lead up to the referendum, and helpful to share more about that today, if that's of interest. We certainly recognise it's challenging for policymakers to understand the impact of our work, which is why we also provide transparency on it. So in December 2022, we reported that since 2017, Meta has removed over 200 operations globally for violating our policy against coordinated inauthentic behaviour, and these networks came from 68 countries and operated in at least 42 languages. We also report publicly on our work and findings to enhance transparency and accountability, for example, through our quarterly Community Standards Enforcement Report and our monthly Adversarial Threat Report. And we also share findings and threat indicators with peers and other organisations to support the identification and combating of threat activity. Finally, we work to actively contribute to the debate around establishing effective regulation to address foreign interference. Meta is a founding member and signatory to the Australian Disinformation and Misinformation Industry Code, which has been a major step in establishing a regulatory framework around industry's work to combat misinformation. And we've also developed global principles to guide regulation and legislation around foreign influence operations. So to conclude, combating foreign interference requires multi-sectoral, whole-of-society approaches towards building a strong security ecosystem, not only within Australia, but across the region and globally. And so we therefore encourage that any further regulatory measures be considered against the broader geopolitical context and the state of the global internet, as well as with regard to individual human rights such as freedom of expression, freedom of speech and access to information and, of course, privacy. So we hope that our contribution has been helpful and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks very much, Ms Garlick. I'm grateful for your attendance and your participation today and also your submission and your opening statement. I'll start with some questions and then I'll offer the call to the Deputy Chair, Senator Walsh. I know Senator Chandler has questions and Senator Rennick, who's dialed in on the phone, also has questions, so I'll make sure we get to all of them in the time that we have. In particular, I want to revisit an issue that was in your submission and you've just referred to in your opening statement today, which is this issue of over 200 operations of coordinated inauthentic behaviour from 68 countries. In your submission, you say that mostly targeted audiences in their home countries, but around a third of them were aimed at audiences abroad. So that is what fits in that classic definition of a foreign interference operation, coordinated inauthentic behaviour targeting another country. That transparency is welcome. Thank you for disclosing that to the committee in your submission. I wonder if you can break down those numbers any further. The 1/3 that were aimed at audiences abroad, some of those would have included scams and financially motivated, I imagine, and some of them would have been politically motivated, or were they all politically motivated?
Thanks, Chair. I'm happy to jump in on that one. It's a very good point that under our definition of coordinated inauthentic behaviour, we try to capture both financially motivated and politically motivated operations. So that's correct. It covers both under that number.
Can you break it down any further? What's the balance between the two?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, Chair. Very happy to see what we might be able to provide on notice. I think there is that level of detail within the transparency reporting that we make available every quarter, but I just don't have the number available.
That's okay.
We do also try to take every major operation. We try to talk through where we believe it has originated from, the types of audiences and countries that it's targeting, the use of tactics according to each operation, and also threat indicators like domains or other identifiers that other peers in industry are able to use in order to combat those operations as well. So I think we generally have that level of detail. I just don't have that number to hand for you.
That's okay. If you could take it on notice and come back to the committee, that'd be helpful. Sure. In your submission, you say that there were 4 instances of coordinated inauthentic behaviour that targeted Australians. Can you tell me whether any of those or how many of those were politically motivated?
Sure thing. So, Chair, let me take you through all 4 of them because there are complexions of both politics and finance across them. 3 of those operations we detected and removed in 2019 and 1 we removed in 2020. One of them was political and involved domestic actors in the context of the New South Wales state election in early 2019. We made information about that publicly available at the time and very happy to provide more detail on it if it's useful. 2 other operations, we took action on them in the context of the 2019 federal election. One of those originated from Kosovo and one of those originated from India. Although they used political content in order to try and reach their audiences, it's consistent with the behaviours of financially motivated actors. It did not appear to be an ideology or political agenda that those groups were engaged in, but rather trying to get people to follow through links to websites that were ad farms, essentially, so they could generate some revenue off it. The 4th one occurred in 2020 and is associated with a group referred to as Truth Media. This targeted Australia as one of a large number of countries, including Canada, the US, New Zealand, Vietnam, Taiwan, a large number of countries around the world. That targeted English and Chinese-speaking audiences. We provided some detailed information about it at the time that we removed it in 2020. And my recollection is that perhaps that one was classified as a political CIB rather than a financially motivated one. Happy to provide more information about any of those if it's useful.
Yeah, just on that last one, what was the assessed motivation of the actor in that instance?
I would probably have to take that on notice, Chair. I mean, as this committee will appreciate, we're very careful in trying to attribute motivations, locations and associations for any of these networks when we make them publicly available. It's important to provide that transparency, but we also don't want to speculate. I would want to just double check exactly around the motivations and location of that group. I'm very happy to provide it on notice. I know that we had conversations with Australian security agencies and policymakers around the time that we removed it.
Thank you. Yes, any further detail you could provide on notice would be helpful. All of these are dated prior to December 22. Have there been any further networks that you have identified and taken down in this calendar year?
Well, so far we've released one adversarial threat report covering the first quarter of this year. So we haven't yet published information about the second quarter of this year. That's a report that's forthcoming quite soon. There were a number of interesting elements about that first quarterly adversarial report, though, which might be of use to the committee. There were two CIB networks originating out of China that we took action on. I should clarify that these targeted audiences globally. I don't believe Australia was one of the jurisdictions that was included, but it is perhaps of interest for the committee because we have seen quite a shift in tactics and approach by China-based actors over the past 7 months or so. 50% of the China-originating CIB networks that we have actioned in the last 4 years, we've taken down in the last 7 months. And we are seeing a whole range of new tactics evolving, such as operations that are linked to troll farms, attempts to co-opt journalists, NGOs or other respected third parties, attempts to work through PR firms. Now, when we're detecting these operations, although they are fairly new tactics to the China originating operations, we've seen them in other CIB networks for quite some period of time. And so we are having success in detecting and removing them before they're able to get much traction or get much of an audience on our services.
And sorry, just to jump in there, Mr. Merchant, if my memory serves me correctly, one of those instances involved a kind of a faux news website that commented on a range of political issues that were not necessarily related directly to the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. If I remember correctly, there were some instances of promoting anti-immigrant sentiment in the UK, commentary about Brexit. That's a very interesting development in that behaviour, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely, Chair. You're spot on. That is an evolution in tactics that we're seeing from the China originating operations. I think you're referring to the one that worked through an organisation called the New Europe Observation. And that was a network that targeted a very broad section of the world, everywhere from Taiwan to sub-Saharan Africa to Japan, but in particular Uyghur diaspora and populations around the globe. So hopefully that transparency to policymakers such as yourselves, but also cybersecurity experts in the field, other companies, people who are watching what happens on our services, hopefully that transparency is useful because we are seeing an evolution in the tactics out of particularly networks and operations originating out of China, which may be of interest to the committee.
Thank you. And I appreciate that the second quarter has only just passed, but if there's any findings in that quarterly report which is relevant for the committee's work, we would appreciate it if you could provide it to us as soon as possible so we can factor it into our reporting. Moving on to another topic, there does appear to be instances of transnational repression and coercion that are taking place on a range of social media platforms from authoritarian states. There's been some reporting in the New York Times about this, not just affecting Facebook but other platforms as well. And one of the witnesses before this inquiry a few months ago, Vicky Xu, was a victim and a target of this, where some harassing material about her was posted on YouTube, on Twitter and on Facebook. How concerned about this is Meta, and what steps do you have to monitor this sort of foreign interference?
Perhaps I can begin, Chair, by talking a little bit about that specific instance, and then Mia might be able to talk about safety more broadly. So it's a top priority of us to ensure the safety of our users on our platforms, regardless of who may be harassing them, whether it's for political purposes or otherwise. And so in that respect, many of the approaches that we take to safety or protecting public figures generally are relevant and useful when it comes to instances where there might be transnational harassment. We are particularly live to the risk of mass harassment that happens in the context of foreign interference. And in fact, that's part of the component of our quarterly adversarial threat reporting that we've particularly highlighted as a trend that we're conscious of. I think in instances such as the one that was brought before the committee, there's a number of steps that we take in terms of proactive detection and removal of fake accounts, but also the community standards that we have to prevent bullying or harassment of any user, but including public figures on our platform. In that instance, we had some specific pieces of content drawn to our attention, which had been posted on our services. They were egregious and they violated our community standards. So we appreciated those being brought to us directly by the individual concerned and associated contacts, and we were able to remove them quite quickly. But that approach that we have to make ourselves accessible and available to individuals and experts to come to us when they might be experiencing it is in addition to the broader systems that we have in place to detect this type of behaviour proactively and remove it ahead of people experiencing that. But Mia might have more to add.
Yes, I think just sort of broadly, obviously, there's the specifics of individual cases, but we have unfortunately seen sort of an increase in sort of harassment and bullying of public figures. And so over the years, we did make a very big distinction between private individuals and public figures and allow, a much greater degree of debate and engagement with public figures, but have narrowed our policies over the years to limit sort of to provide greater protection to public figures where, there's gendered abuse or there's certain types of mass harassments. And then we've also invested in different tools as we've seen different types of behaviour unfold. So, for example, on Instagram, there's the limits tool that you can turn on and that will stop newly created accounts or accounts that don't follow you or have only recently followed you from commenting or sending you messages. So there's a range of different measures there that can also be suited to the broader foreign interference concerns that are based on the general trends that we've seen in relation to safety and integrity on our services.
Thank you. I've just got two further topics to pursue and then I'll have the call to colleagues. Meta has recently launched the Threads app, which is being identified as a rival to Twitter. You may not accept that characterisation or not, but for the purposes of this conversation, let's just assume that it is. I'm interested in the policies that the Threads app is going to take towards state-affiliated media or government-funded media, because, of course, Twitter previously used to proactively identify that sort of content and recently ceased doing so, which is extremely concerning from a transparency point of view. Users are not able to easily identify what is a state-affiliated media or not, and if the platforms don't proactively label them, then there's a great risk that they'll be misled about their credibility. What will Meta's approach be on the Threads app, and will it differ in any way to your other platforms?
Chair, I might start us off on that one. So thanks for the chance to talk about it. Of course, we're very excited about the launch of this new product. Threads is not yet 1 week old. What the approach that we have taken with that particular product is at the point of launch, all of the policies that currently apply on Facebook and Instagram apply on Threads. So anything that would be removed or would violate our community standards on Facebook and Instagram from day one is being removed on Threads as well. Of course, though, it is only a couple of days old. We're still building out broader functionality and partnerships in order to help users spot the integrity of information that could be on Threads. Our CEO of Instagram, Adam Mosseri, has talked about some of our aspirations to apply some of that very good work and the lessons that we've learned on Facebook and Instagram to Threads. And so areas such as labels for state-affiliated media, partnerships with fact-checkers are all areas where we see a lot of value, and it's our aspiration to build that out fairly quickly, expeditiously. It's only a couple of days, and we're delighted with the very positive reception that the product has had after its release, and the team's working very quickly in order to add all of the additional integrity functionality that people are used to on Facebook and Instagram. But of course, it has only been a couple of days, and so that's...
So just to be clear, though, just so there's no doubt in my mind or the committee's mind, to give you two concrete examples, the Xinhua news agency from China or the RT agency from Russia, will they be proactively labelled as state-affiliated media so users can differentiate between them and other sources of information?
That's our aspiration, Chair. Yes. So to the extent that any state-affiliated media are violating our policies, we will remove them today, as would currently be the case on Facebook and Instagram, and broader functionality around tags or labels or additional information and context that we can provide about those users are all top priorities for us as we continue to build out the product. But it's certainly our aspiration to bring those type of integrity measures.
Yeah. Can you give me a sense of timing then? I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that they should be removed. I think sometimes it is important and useful to understand their perspective, but I just wouldn't want users to be misled that these are genuinely free and independent journalistic outlets. They are not. They're propaganda outfits, and they should be labelled as such. You say it's your aspiration. You've got tens of millions of users already signing up and using the platform. When will you be able to have policies like that in place?
Yeah, I understand, Chair. I don't have a time frame I can give you today, but we're very happy to take that on notice and come back to the committee with any additional information we can. And of course, to continue that conversation with Australian policymakers about the right integrity measures for a text-based application like Threads.
Okay, and then just a final topic for me before I offer the call to colleagues. Although this committee is very seriously concerned with the issue of particularly state-sponsored disinformation, the harm that can do to our democracy, speaking for myself, I'm equally concerned about the protection of the freedom of speech rights of Australians, and I would not want to see them inadvertently curtailed or restricted in a quest to tackle disinformation or misinformation. In that light, I am concerned about the proposed new code or the legislation amendment combating misinformation and disinformation bill from the Communications Department, which has been released. I'm concerned that will stray far too far into legitimate areas of disagreement on public policy from Australians, and I wouldn't want to see particularly Silicon Valley headquartered tech firms deciding what is the acceptable terms of public debate within Australia. That's a matter for Australians to determine. I would be interested in your views on the draft bill and and how you're going to appropriately balance the need to protect those free speech rights.
Yeah, understood, Chair. Again, perhaps I can start us off and Mia may have more to add. So obviously this draft legislation has been released in recent weeks, and we're working through the detail and trying to prepare a thoughtful and constructive submission that we can make available to Australian policymakers when submissions are due pretty soon. And so very, very happy to provide information about that when it's available. But there are a couple of initial thoughts and positions that we have here that I'm very happy to share. The first is that there is already an existing voluntary industry code on misinformation and disinformation that exists in Australia. This was developed by a number of companies at the request of the government in 2020. Meta was one of the founding members and drivers behind that voluntary code, and we're very strong supporters of it. We believe that voluntary industry model is a good way to both address the concern of policymakers and communities about the transparency of the approach that we take to combating misinformation and foreign interference, but also balancing the very important imperative of protecting free expression and making sure we're not overly censoring people online. So a voluntary approach almost has the best of both worlds to our mind. That code's been in place a number of years. We've released 3 annual reports under it, in which we've actually provided some quite unprecedented transparency about the types of measures that we put in place, including some Australia-specific statistics on misinformation and disinformation. So we believe that is a very effective, unprecedented, very good model. To the extent that policymakers would like to have a role for an independent regulator, like the Australian Communications and Media Authority, to properly enforce that industry code and to really hold companies to account, we understand that objective. We support that. That's understandable. There can be some difficulties in enforcing an industry code that's overseen by an industry association, so having a regulator in charge of that makes some sense. But of course, the draft legislation goes further than just enforcing this particular code It also empowers the ACMA to, for example, develop binding standards around misinformation and disinformation with some very substantial civil penalties and also criminal penalties for individuals who are involved. And that is the part of the legislation that we're looking at quite closely. We can see some potential for that for that power to be abused, or for it to be used in a way that inadvertently chills free and legitimate political expression online. We're thinking through some constructive suggestions we can make about checks and balances or exclusions or other approaches that might be able to meet those legitimate policy objectives. As I say, we think the voluntary industry code's a good model, and perhaps some teeth around that could be beneficial. So that's our initial take on the draft legislation. We'll have more to say once we've worked through the detail.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I do welcome your sensitivity around those issues and recognition of the potential unintended consequences. Just finally, though, to kind of put this in practical terms, even under the voluntary policies that you and other platforms have had in place in recent years, there has been content which has been labelled as misinformation and which its spread has been restricted in some form, depending on the platform, which we've subsequently learned, in fact, wasn't misinformation. And to give a concrete example of this, the theory at the early beginnings of the pandemic that it might have been a lab accident, that it involved the commencement of the virus. Now, I should stress, we don't know still today whether it was natural in origin or whether it came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but the US intelligence community was asked by the Biden administration to look into this, and they are divided on that question. Some intelligence agencies in the US believe it's natural in origin, others believe that it is the possibility of a lab leak. Either way, that seems like an issue which should be up for debate until we do have conclusive answers on that either way. But it was restricted on your platform. Do you have any reflections or lessons learned from that?
Yeah, Chair, I might just jump in, and then obviously, Josh, anything that you wanted to add. I mean, I think in terms of going back to your principle that you identified at the start of your question, Chair, around US-based multinational technology companies should not necessarily be deciding some of these matters. We fully support that principle, which is why we've worked very closely to make sure that we're getting advice from different expert groups and government agencies around where to set our policies around harmful misinformation. And that's then why we also invest in independent fact checkers, and we also then publish transparency reports through codes like the Australian codes, and have fact checks published on the fact checker websites as well, so that there can be this debate around what content has been marked for removal or marked as false, and so there can be transparency applied across all of industry, and then we can have a conversation around what those appropriate measures are on the different platforms, because we don't all have the same policies or transparency measures, and I think that's an important part of the public debate. With respect to the information that was deemed either harmful and removed or labelled as misinformation during the pandemic, they were extraordinary circumstances, and we were operating with the best information that we were being advised on at the time. But I'm not sure if you've seen, and happy to provide it on notice if that's helpful, our proactive referral to the Oversight Board. So that's an independent decision-making body that we've established, again, because we don't think that we should be a final arbiter of a lot of the content decisions on our services. And so we made a proactive referral to the Oversight Board, asking them, what should we now do about a lot of our policies in relation to the pandemic, now that hopefully we're at the end of the pandemic. And there's a whole program of work now in place to review our policies, to further consult and engage with people to identify where the appropriate balance should be drawn.
But do you recognise it was a mistake in that instance?
Well, I think these were sort of fast evolving times, and there were lots of people who were providing us with advice around what types of misinformation would constitute harm. And we're under our global policies, if we're advised that by experts that particular pieces of misinformation would either cause real-world harm or imminent physical danger, then we were working to remove those, and we published a list of the claims that we were removing in our help centre. I think there were around 64, if I recall correctly. And then, as information changed and sort of intelligence and knowledge changed, we then made updates to those to change what content we were actioning.
I guess that just highlights the challenge, though. Even very eminent independent experts can be wrong, and it's not a slur on them. It's just because information is imperfect at various times. And doesn't that lead you to the conclusion that less censorship rather than more is the safest option, given that even experts can be wrong in hindsight?
I think the way that we've tried to approach it is to set up sort of independent accountability systems and transparency systems so that people have confidence that we are not the sole decision maker here, and that we're consulting widely, and that there is transparency so people can see what decisions are being made, and that can contribute then to the public debate around where to draw the line.
Okay, thank you. I should share